What is happening inside Gaza and Israel resonates throughout the Middle East. I'm Yair Pinto, and I'm handing over this report to our expert, Mati Shoshani, who will take you deeper in a journey to understand what really is going on in this region.
American soldiers are killed by a missile strike in Syria, but Iran does not take responsibility for the attack. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court in The Hague reaches its ruling, and Egypt turns on Israel. Elsewhere, will the Houthis get involved with Russia and China to counter attacks from the US and Great Britain? So let's get started with everything that happened this week in our neighborhood. In the Middle East, people are used to unrest and instability. But even by Middle Eastern standards, there's a lot going on and everyone is on high alert. In fact, all over the world, more and more fronts are heating up and things could escalate quickly. In fact, things might have already escalated here in the Middle East, with Iran crossing a red line by ordering its proxy militias to attack a US base in Jordan, which resulted in 3 US soldiers killed and 34 others wounded. The attack on the Tower 22 base in northeast Jordan, near the Syrian border and housing approximately 350 US soldiers, was carried out using a UAV apparently launched from Syrian territory. Although it is not the first attack on US troops since the start of the Iron Swords War between Israel and Hamas, it is the first time there have been American fatalities. Iran has denied involvement, but it's very hard to take that seriously considering the level of control they have over those areas in Syria. For what it's worth, however, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Nasser Kanani said that the resistance factions in the region make their own decisions and do not receive orders from Iran regarding support for the Palestinian people or the defense of their country. US President Joe Biden declared during remarks on Sunday that the US would hold those responsible for the attack to account, that while the circumstances of the attack are still being investigated, we know it was carried out by extremist militant groups supported by Iran that have been operating in Syria and Iraq. It turns out that it walks like a duck, looks like a duck, and makes duck noises. It's probably Iran in this case. In any event, this attack narrows President Biden's political room for maneuver, which until now allowed him to order attacks on Iranian proxies such as the Houthis in Yemen, but avoided direct confrontation with Iran itself. This attack will necessitate a much more robust US response, and everyone is now bracing themselves for that response and what will happen next. An unnamed analyst spoke with the Bloomberg news agency about the situation, saying that the US response could take many different forms, including an attack on Iranian territory that the US didn't publicly take responsibility for, but it would be something everyone knew only the US could do. Assassinations of senior Iranian officials, such as the drone strike which killed IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020, is also a possibility. As Israeli officials often say, in the Middle East, there is no mercy for the weak, and enemies are always looking for a crack in the defenses of their opponents that can be exploited. That's why whatever form the American punishment for this deadly attack takes, it will need to be very strong in order to deter Iran from retaliating and escalating. In recent months, the US and UK have absorbed many attacks by Iran's proxies without responding, and when a response finally did come, it was fairly unimpressive attacks on the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. These attacks didn't succeed in convincing the Iranians to back off, but rather it emboldened them to push harder. This is a mistake America cannot afford to make again. The pro-Iranian militias in eastern Syria seem to have figured that out, as there are reports that they're evacuating some of their fixed positions in anticipation of a strong American response. But not everyone is afraid of what the Americans might do next. Hamas, the Iranian-backed terrorist group, which Israel has been fighting in the Gaza Strip ever since the massacre of October 7th, has issued a statement saying that the deadly attack on US troops was a message to the American government. Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Zuhri added that the continuation of the American Zionist aggression in Gaza could cause a regional explosion. Last week, the US Treasury and the Finance Ministry of Britain and Australia announced a new round of sanctions against Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group. These sanctions include measures to limit the access Hamas and the PIJ operatives have to establish networks and digital currencies. This move came amidst reports that several banks in South Africa are providing services to the Quds Foundation, a Hamas-front organization. It is worth noting that South Africa is known as an easy place to buy, sell, and transport weapons and other contraband globally, as there are several international airports, seaports, and land corridors running north to the rest of Africa. Law enforcement is weak and corrupt, and a recent report by the BBC has said that violent crime in South Africa has reached the highest levels in over 20 years. As usual, this week, the Houthis are playing with fire, launching drone and missile strikes on civilian and military shipping in the Red Sea. They even drew some negative attention from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has been largely focused on Ukraine for the most of the past 2 years. They accomplished this impressive feat by firing a missile that almost hit an Indian-flagged tanker ship that was carrying Russian crude oil. India and China have thrown Russia an economic lifeline amidst Western sanctions meant to dissuade the Kremlin from pushing the war in Ukraine by buying large volumes of Russian crude. This cargo was part of that trade. President Putin was reportedly very irritated upon hearing that the Houthis had almost damaged this cargo. However, the incident took place shortly after a delegation of representatives from several of the world's major terrorist organizations met in Moscow with Russian Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov. During the meeting, the parties discussed how to divide the evil in the world. This is a joke, of course. I'm not sure what else they could have been talking about. However, President Putin isn't the only one who's expressing irritation with the Houthis. Egypt relies heavily on revenue from the transit fees paid by international shipping firms for the privilege of sailing through the Suez Canal. Since the Houthis started shooting at ships bound for the canal, many shipping firms have announced that they will send their ships around the Cape of Good Hope, which is in South Africa, instead. This adds several days and millions of dollars in cost to the trip, but saving the transit fees they would usually be paying to Egypt. In order to address the situation, Egypt has announced that they will use their very powerful air and naval forces, which they built with the US assistance, to attack the Houthis and force them to stop disrupting this lucrative maritime traffic through the Suez Canal. Actually, that's not a true headline. Egypt could have done that, but instead, according to a report this week in the Al Arabi Al Jadid, Egypt is trying to convince the Houthis to restrict their attacks on ships that are sailing to or from Israeli ports, or that have had some other direct connection to Israel. However, the report said that the Houthis have rejected this idea. To be fair with the Egyptians, the Houthis haven't shown any flexibility in the face of US and British military strikes either. So far, the US has carried out 8 rounds of air and missile strikes on the Houthis since January 11th, 2 of which included participation by British aircraft. Some of the most sophisticated weapons in America's vast arsenal were used in the strikes, including Tomahawk cruise missiles that were launched from submarines and laser-guided bombs dropped by aircraft from the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. But the Houthis remain defiant, vowing to not only continue their attacks on civilian shipping, but even to retaliate against the US and British military strikes. This show of defiance by a small, impoverished terrorist group operating in a country suffering from some of the worst humanitarian conditions in the world could be devastating for America's global deterrence posture and badly discredit US foreign policy. This failure is already on display as reports emerged on Monday that a British-owned oil tanker named Marlin Luanda was hit by several missiles in the Gulf of Eden. British maritime security company Ambrey issued a report that a fire broke out on a merchant ship from the missiles hit from Yemen, southeast of Aden. However, there might be one country which can exert some influence to stop the Houthis from targeting civilian shipping, and that is China. According to the Reuters news agency, officials in Beijing have made it clear to Iran that what the Houthis are doing is bad for business, and if Chinese business interests continue to be damaged, it will have an effect on overall relations between China and Iran. A spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, quoted in the Reuters report, said that China calls for an end to interference with civilian ships. However, and this is a big however, the spokesman also said that China is displeased with the fact that the UN did not authorize the use of force against Yemen. And without any shame or irony, he called for all countries to respect Yemen's sovereignty. If I can offer my own interpretation of China's position, it's that everyone can do whatever they want as long as it doesn't damage China's economic bottom line. Also, we can see that China will never miss an opportunity to poke America in the eye. Also this week, UNRWA faces fall-off in funding after revelations of terrorist connections. This week, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres admitted that several employees of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, what a lovely short title, known as UNRWA, were directly involved in the Hamas massacre of October 7, 2023. He wasn't inspired to do this out of a sudden outburst of kindness or honesty, but rather he was compelled to take this action by evidence that Israel has provided that ties these UNRWA employees directly to the terrorist massacre. This evidence prompted several countries to suspend funding to UNRWA. This move was loudly protested by UNRWA's Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, as well by Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, Secretary General Hussein el-Sheikh. Online discussions of the issue also included some comments suggesting that Western governments were responsible for allowing Israel to come into existence in 1948, and so the money they donate to UNRWA is simply reparation payments for that original mistake, quote unquote. However, by Monday evening, it was reported that more countries had decided to suspend funding, and even the European Union was looking into doing so. After so many years in which the UN has ignored evidence of UNRWA's support for and the involvement in incitement to terrorism, it is correct and proper for civilized countries to cut their funding to this organization. A serious and thorough investigation must be made into the extent of Hamas's penetration of UNRWA and the overlap between this UN aid agency and the terrorist organization. There should also be an investigation into how much of the money that was meant to aid people ended up building terrorism. This week, the International Court of Justice rendered an interim decision on accusations made by South Africa at the end of December 2023, alleging a violation of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or the Genocide Convention. The High Court did not accept Israel's request to dismiss the lawsuit outright and ordered several temporary orders, which will be in effect until the final verdict in the process, which is expected to take several years. The temporary orders are highly insulting to Israel and imply that South Africa's accusations are at least valid enough to justify further investigation. They are possible, it must be noted, by virtue of the International Court of Justice authority to grant temporary relief when it appears that there is a violation of rights under the Convention, and that there is an urgency to grant the relief. With that in mind, the High Court ordered Israel to do the following. Take all possible measures to prevent acts that fall within the scope of the definition of genocide in the Convention. Ensure immediately and effectively that the military forces do not carry out these acts. To take all the means in its disposal to prevent and punish for public and direct incitement to commit genocide on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. To take immediate and effective measures to enable the delivery of basic services and humanitarian aid that are urgently needed in response to the severe humanitarian crisis and living conditions of the Palestinians in Gaza. To take effective measures that will prevent the destruction of evidence related to the commission of genocide and ensure their preservation. To present within a month a report on the steps taken by it to fulfill the order. However, it's important to note that the main request made by South Africa that the court issues a legally binding decision for Israel to immediately stop fighting Hamas was rejected by the court. Also, the court ordered that parties to the conflict take whatever steps necessary to ensure the release of hostages. In response to the temporary orders, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel is fighting a just war. We are fighting against the Hamas monsters who murdered, raped, and kidnapped our citizens. We will continue to do everything to protect ourselves and our citizens while upholding international law. Like every country, Israel has the basic right to self-defense. The Hague Tribunal rightly rejects the outrageous demand to deprive us of this right. He continued and said that every claim that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians is not just false, it is outrageous. And the court's willingness to discuss it at all is a mark of disgrace that will not be erased for generations. We're fighting a just war, and we will continue it until the complete victory. Until we defeat Hamas, we will return all our abducted and guarantee that Gaza will no longer pose a threat to Israel. That's everything that happened this week in the Middle East. If you want to know more and keep up to date with events, make sure to follow this channel.